I'm Tom Brokaw. We're about to see how fast the familiar geography of one generation is often erased by the hit-and-run years of another. It's the early 1950s, and the places on the map are Panmunjom, Incheon, and the Yalu River. In Korea, names remembered by only a few. Names from a war not even called a war, but a police action. It was a nasty, bitter, 3-year struggle, all about a line on the map labeled the 38th parallel. In this Blue Ribbon NBC News documentary, the Korean conflict is brought center stage. American veterans later coined it the Forgotten War. The narrator here is the late television and movie actor Richard Boone. Unlike Vietnam, much of Korea was spent in foxholes and trenches. Thousands died while peace talks seemed to go on interminably in the face of daily bloodshed. Who won? Who lost? Was it a stand against communism or a tragic stalemate? Questions about that war in Korea still being asked 2 wars later. Judge for yourself.
We are not at war, the president said. This time there was a new name for it. This time in 1950 it was called something else. But the troop ships were leaving in the same old way, and the women watched them go in the same old way. It looked like war. It hurt like war. It was war. It was that war in Korea. It was a hard war to explain. What are we doing in this hellhole 7,000 miles from home? What are we doing here? Somebody called it a war we couldn't win and couldn't lose and couldn't quit. It was called a brush fire war, a limited war. But they kill you just as dead in a limited war as in any other. There is no limit on death. Here in Korea, 54,000 Americans went all the way. As far as any American ever went at Valley Forge, or Gettysburg, or in the Argonne, or at Iwo Jima. Here dead we lie because we did not choose to live and shame the land from which we sprung. Life, to be sure, is nothing much to lose, but young men think it is, and we were young. Tokyo in 1950, 5 years after VJ Day, after victory in World War II. The Japanese, who had fought like tigers, were taking defeat like lambs, and the occupation was going swimmingly. For the American troops, it was more like a sightseeing tour than a tour of duty. In a quaint and curious land, the soldiers themselves seemed a little quaint, a little curious. In the age of the ultimate weapon, the big bomb, who needed soldiers anymore? The rocket's red glare had long since become the flash of nightclub neon, and Army life, for the most, was summed up by a bit of Army slang: no sweat. The theme song of the occupation could well have been the popular Tin Pan Alley tune of the time. Its title was Enjoy Yourself. Enjoy yourself, the song said. Nobody was paying any attention to the line that went, "It's later than you think." It was getting late that summer in 1950. Westward across the Sea of Japan, in a different country, not very far away, a different tune was being played. Korea, North Korea, a satellite controlled by the Soviet Union as a result of the Second World War. North Korea, an armed camp. Russian equipment, heavy tanks from Vladivostok, and Russian-trained troops to man them. While the Western world looked elsewhere, everywhere but here, for the next outbreak of communist aggression, the North Korean People's Army was already on the march, 90,000 fanatical troops obedient to the commands of the Kremlin. An exhortation to the North Korean troops said, "Let us protect our glorious pride by completely annihilating the enemy." The enemy, as always, would be freedom. The target would be South Korea. For Korea, this land of the morning calm, was a divided one, cut in half at the whim of two great powers. For the Korean people, World War II had meant liberation from 40 years of ruthless rule by Japan. Korea had seen many a conqueror come and go, but now something new had come to Korea. Here in the South, under the shield of the United States, a republic was established that held the hope of eventual unity and independence. But an ancient Korean proverb said, "The water downstream will not be clear if the water upstream is muddied." A slash across the map at the 38th parallel was what divided Korea, north and south. But the 38th parallel did more. It divided two worlds. On June 25th, 1950, the two worlds collided. The North Korean communists attacked the Republic of South Korea. The South Korean army, outnumbered and overwhelmed, broke under the surprise assault. With its open, armed aggression, communism overnight made Korea the powder keg of the world. The world could not ignore the agony of the Korean people, and from among the 20 million of them under the shield of the United States, a voice was raised and it said, "Should Korea die deserted, a wail will be heard through the corridors of history, whispering to the nations, adieu to allies, adieu forever to collective security." From 7,000 miles away, there came an answering voice. It was the voice of the American delegate to the United Nations, and it said,
"The Republic of Korea has appealed to the United Nations for protection. I am proud to report that the United States is prepared to furnish assistance to the Republic of Korea."
To the 7th U.S. Fleet in the Western Pacific came the word of President Truman in Washington. "I have ordered United States Air and Sea Forces to give the Korean government troops cover and support. By executive order, without declaration of war, America was in it. America was in it with planes and ships because a communist Korea would threaten Japan and endanger Formosa and undermine the whole American position in Asia. But planes and ships were not enough to stop the communist advance. On June the 30th, 1950, America made the ultimate commitment. In the age of push-button warfare, in the time of the big bomb, the foot soldier who wasn't going to be needed again got his marching orders. Korea was his war, like all the other wars. It was never officially called a war. It was called a police action. A police action organized to halt a bandit raid. But a surprise, an ugly one, awaited the first American troops in Korea. The bandits were carrying bigger clubs than the police. sometimes American troops, unseasoned and unprepared, broke and ran. The word for it in Korea was bugging out. The Soviet tanks kept coming and the obsolete bazookas couldn't stop them. They kept coming and the mortars couldn't stop them. Nothing stopped them. I can't stand it, a sergeant said. Seeing friends get it and not being able to help drives you crazy. I thought the Hurtgen Forest in Germany was bad in Normandy, but they were nothing like this. This was awful. They had come from the easy occupation life of Japan, physically soft and mentally unready. The brutal shock of Korea was changing them from civilians in uniform to soldiers. The price they paid was grievous. But history would say this of them: they were the first American troops to take the field against communist aggression. The enemy's superiority was 3-1 and 8-1 and sometimes 20-1. For the Americans, it was a nightmare of far too little and much too late. Hold when you can, fall back when you must. Not every American knew what he was fighting for in Korea, but many learned what they were fighting against. Where communism marched, its wake was marked by horror. Their road led south down the stricken peninsula toward the sea, and their way was haunted by the specter of Bataan and of Corregidor and Dunkirk. And the communist order of the day was exulting. Comrades, it said, the enemy is demoralized. The American Supreme Command was saying something else. It was telling the world, the skill and valor of our troops in successive holding actions have bought the precious time necessary to build a secure base. They had bought time, but time was running out. A soldier who was there said, I guess I'm lucky. I'm still alive. But what it did to me, oh my God, what it did to me. One last foothold remained in August of 1950. One last corner. The enemy had all the rest. But in that corner, within the perimeter, was the finest harbor in Korea, Pusan. They came pouring into Pusan together, the supplies and the men that said the communist war in Korea is a war against the United Nations. For the first time in 5,000 years of recorded human history, a world organization was taking up arms to oppose aggression and keep the peace. But Pusan had a nickname, Desperation Corner. With the sea at their backs, the perimeter troops were forced to face the most massive attacks of the war. For if Pusan fell, all Korea fell with it. Now the orders were, stand or die. The immediate problem was to hold on to Pusan, and it was held by troops under 3-star General Walton Walker and 2-star General William Dean. Dean was destined to become one of the war's heroes, and Walker and his 8th Army would be famous for their bulldog defense of the perimeter. But the entire picture of the Korean War would be changed, altered with one brilliant stroke by another general. Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Allied Commander, Pacific. Once in another time of disaster in the Philippines, he had said, "I shall return." Now at the low ebb of Korea, he planned another great reversal, and this time he said, "I shall crush them." "I must have the Marines," MacArthur said. And they came marching, the 1st Marine Division, the old breed of Guadalcanal and Peleliu, Okinawa, and the new breed too, boys who had never stood in battle but were ready to face it. The regulars went and the reservists went, and their women watched them go as women of the Marines have watched and wept through all the years, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Now their men were going to the farthest and strangest war of all. The amphibious assault, MacArthur said, is the most powerful tool we have. We must use it to strike hard and deep into enemy territory. So the Yellow Sea saw a spectacle which many thought would never be seen again. An American naval task force bearing down on a hostile shore. Land behind the enemy, cut him off, destroy him. That was the mission of the Marines. They would need all their skill as fighting men and all their legendary courage to do it. The objective was the port of Incheon, high on the west coast of Korea. A Navy specialist said of it, "We drew up a list of every conceivable natural and geographic handicap. Incheon had them all. Tides were the 2nd highest in the world, often 36 feet. The channel impossibly narrow, mined and treacherous. But MacArthur said, "The Navy has never let me down in the past. It will not let me down this time." He had conceived the strategy of it, knowing where and when and how to strike, and daring to do it. But he had said, "I must have the Marines." Now it was up to them. They went in at high tide on September 15th, 1950. The 1st Marines and the 5th Marines. They scaled the high stone seawall that girdled the harbor, and they stormed into Incheon. And they took it. But the real prize was 18 miles farther inland. Seoul, the capital of South Korea. Take Seoul and you cut off and isolate the communist armies. Take Seoul and you surround and destroy them. So after Incheon, those were the orders to the Marines. Take Seoul. Places the Marines have ever fought, few were more hotly contested than the streets of Seoul. To those who said Korea was a minor, marginal skirmish in the fight for freedom, an answer could be given. Tell that to the Marines. They ran out of stretchers for their wounded. They had to use house doors. When he first conceived his classic Incheon operation, General MacArthur had called it a 5,000-to-1 gamble, but he had won. Douglas MacArthur was a man used to winning. He had the victor's style, and with the style of a victor, he proceeded to restore the capital he'd liberated to its people. From President Syngman Rhee, he accepted the thanks of the Republic of South Korea. But it was only an interlude. He would carry his banner far beyond the city of Seoul. In the Great Korean Turnabout, the surge was northward now. Up from Seoul in the west, out of the perimeter in the east. And now the orders to the 8th Army were, pursue and destroy the enemy. North Korea, enemy terrain. The invader was being invaded. Pursue and destroy. Wherever the enemy resisted, he was hit. Wherever he was hit, he was broken. The same troops that had once reeled back under the North Korean onslaught now turned the North Korean retreat into a rout. The troops hadn't heard before came from the jubilant Koreans all along the way. Manzai, hooray for victory. Now surely peace would come and communism would go and all Korea would be united. the farthest limits of Korea, into the forbidding valley of the Yalu where it forms the border with Manchuria. The 8th Army came north, and the 10th Corps. With them came their South Korean allies who had vowed to wash their swords in the Yalu and were about to do it. The Marines made camp at Chosin Reservoir. Frozen Chosin, they called it. Winter came early, sweeping down from Siberia from the roof of the world. But the enemy had evaporated. The fighting was over, wasn't it? All along the front, the word was back in Japan by Christmas. There was Thanksgiving turkey all around and the best possible trimmings to go with it. The war was over, wasn't it? Korea was not a war like other wars, and not to be won like other wars. Across the border in Manchuria, beyond the silent mountains, and across the sullen Yalu, another enemy was waiting. Secretly, silently, at crossing points all along the border, 300,000 communist Chinese troops came flooding into Korea, and they hit with the impact of a tidal wave. Red China had struck, and suddenly it was a new war, a bigger war, and an infinitely more ominous war. A Marine lieutenant remembered how it was. I felt like crying, he said. But continual sudden death all around protected the heart with a certain callousness. And a dispatch from the front was saying, the flower of the U.S. Army, almost the whole effective army that America had, was caught in a desperate retreat. If this defeat were allowed to stand, the dispatch said, it would mean the loss of Asia to communism. Thousands of years ago, in another age, when the Assyrians fell upon the children of Israel in another little land, the voice of the prophet was raised in lament. What will ye do in the day of visitation, and in the desolation which shall come from far? To whom will ye flee for help? In our time, in Korea, there was cause again for lamentation. They fled south to escape from communism, a silent sermon to the world by 1 million North Korean refugees. At a place called Hagaru at Frozen Chosin, the wounded were being flown out. The Marines had stood and fought against overpowering waves of fresh, battle-hard Chinese. Now for some, there was a reward of sorts. Some could say, I've got that $1 million wound. I've got my ticket out of here. 5,400 wounded were lifted out of Hagaru. Pusan had been called Desperation Corner. Now in the north at Hagaru, in the second Great Korean Reversal, there was a new name. Panicky Pocket. But there wasn't any panic. Not at Udemni or Hagaru or Kotori. The Marines first held off the enemy and then assembled for what history would call the greatest fighting withdrawal of modern times. They were cut off front and rear, outflanked right and left, engulfed by 6 crack Chinese divisions. In Washington, they were being written off as lost. In Peking, the red radio was saying the annihilation of the 1st Marine Division is only a matter of time. But the men inside the Chinese trap were saying, we're coming out. We're coming out fighting. We're coming out like Marines. They turned toward the sea and began an 80-mile march through some of the most savage terrain on Earth. And when reports called it the first Marine retreat in history, their answer was, retreat hell, we're just attacking in another direction. All along that endless, nameless road, the enemy was dug in. All through those murderous mountains, there was battle. They killed the new enemy as they went, and they captured him too. The Chinese peasant soldier, tough and formidable when he came in numbers, but no Superman when outfought and ravaged by the Korean cold. Where are we, the Chinese prisoners often asked. Many thought they were still in Manchuria and that the United States was invading China. A column of 14,000. 12,000 of them Marines and the rest Army troops, South Korean troops, and British Royal Marines. There were two enemies, the Chinese and the weather. 25 degrees below zero. Even Genghis Khan, somebody said, would not have tried Korea in the winter. Without the man in the sky, the man on foot could not have made it. Out of the flying boxcars came manna from heaven. Food, ammunition, medical supplies, the stuff of life that kept the column marching in a barren, hostile land. Not only manna from heaven, but fire and brimstone, too. Fire and death for the enemy on all the hills and ridges and valleys along the route. From the ground, the column summoned terrible punishment on the encircling Chinese. Napalm, jellied gasoline. Once during the worst of it, a Marine was asked what he most wanted if God would grant him any wish. And his answer was, just give me tomorrow. He got his wish. They came down out of the murderous mountains down toward the sea. And one who saw them coming said of them, they paid a terrible price for the right to live. It had cost them more in casualties than Tarawa, but they had left a battered enemy behind them, and they had broken out when neither foe nor friend thought it possible. Now they had made it. Hung Nam on the Sea of Japan, the goal. They came singing a bawdy soldier song, Bless 'Em All, with unprintable lyrics of their own. And with them came thousands of others, troops of the 10th Corps, streaming down from the north. 105,000 men in the greatest sea evacuation in American history. Perimeter now, with gunners pinning the enemy to the surrounding hills until the guns themselves could be trundled aboard ship and leave Hung Nam behind. And again, the refugees. At Hung Nam alone, 100,000 of them. Not a victory. It was an achievement. It saved a reversal from turning into a catastrophe. One thing remained to be done, and the engineers did it. High over Hung Nam Harbor, the last pilot watched the last ships leaving. They formed up, he said, single file, nose and tail, like circus elephants. They headed seaward, then south to Busan. Merry Christmas, the pilot said, for it was Christmas Eve. Korea was the battleground. Moscow was the danger point. From the Kremlin, the red tyrant Stalin, with his Soviet chieftains and Chinese lieutenants, had lit the fuse to the Korean powder keg. How far would they let it burn? All the way to an explosion that meant World War III, atomic war? How far would they dare to go? They went far. They sent in their MiG fighters, expanding Soviet support of Korean aggression and challenging the United States Air Force. And American pilots dominated the skies, and the first jet aces in history made their scores in Korea. In plane-to-plane combat, the MiG, Russia's finest fighter, was slaughtered at the rate of 14 to 1. enemy could escape total destruction, there was a sanctuary to which he could flee. A privileged sanctuary, MacArthur called it. The enemy could flee into Red Manchuria, and there he would be safe. American policy did not permit pilots to cross the Yalu. The border was a barrier. Douglas MacArthur was a man accustomed to winning, and his motto, he said, was the old one of meeting force with maximum counterforce. But now, in this new kind of war, the enemy was being granted untouchable bases, while MacArthur's own operations were subject to what he branded as unparalleled restraint and handicap. He protested to Washington, and from the field he issued policy statements of his own. Douglas MacArthur was on a collision course with his commander-in-chief. Earlier, President Harry Truman had flown halfway across the Pacific to Wake Island to confer with the general in person. Another medal was ceremoniously added to MacArthur's huge collection. But beneath the outward cordiality, there was conflict. Deep dissension on global policy divided the general and the president. Then in Washington, Congressman Martin made public a letter from MacArthur in which the general openly endorsed action against the Chinese mainland, contrary to presidential policy. That policy, approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was to limit the fighting to Korea and to avoid a general war in Asia which might become atomic. The President, with his Secretary of Defense, George Marshall, saw MacArthur's action as open insubordination. Together, they reached a momentous decision. Reporters were summoned from bed at 1 o'clock in the morning of April 11th, 1951, to get the astonishing news. And that night, the nation received an historic announcement from the President.
I believe that we must try to limit the war to Korea for these vital reasons: to make sure that the precious lives of our fighting men are not wasted, to see that the security of our country and the free world is not needlessly jeopardized, and to prevent a third world war. A number of events have made it evident that General MacArthur did not agree with that policy. I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy. It was with the deepest personal regret that I found myself compelled to take this action. General MacArthur is one of our greatest military commanders, but the cause of world peace is much more important than any individual.
The nation was stunned, and the reaction of most Americans was reflected in the face of one particular American. The news rocked Tokyo. To the Japanese, MacArthur was an almost mythological figure who had not only conquered them in war, but ruled over them with enormous power and great wisdom in peace. The Orient had never seen his like, and would not ever again. He knew only one method of waging war: all out and all the way. There is no substitute for victory, he said. But there'd never been a war like Korea before, and now other ideas prevailed. So for the first time in 14 years, at the age of 71, Douglas MacArthur was going home. He came back to Washington, and he came, as he himself said, with neither rancor nor bitterness. General of the Army, Douglas MacArthur was home, and his return was honored by an invitation to address a joint session of the Congress. He would speak of what he called the tragedy of Korea and warn of the folly of any kind of appeasement in Asia. But what lingered in men's minds long after the speech was over was its ending.
I am closing my 52 years of military service. When I joined the Army, even before the turn of the century, it was the fulfillment of all my boyish hopes and dreams. The world has turned over many times since I took the oath on the plain at West Point, and the hopes and dreams have long since vanished. But I still remember the refrain of one of the most popular barrack ballads of that day, which proclaimed most proudly that old soldiers never die. They just fade away. And like the old soldier of that ballad, I now close my military career and just fade away. An old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye.
No old soldier ever faded away in so spectacular a manner. New York proclaimed MacArthur Day, and New York spoke for the nation. No doubt as to where Douglas MacArthur stood in the hearts of his countrymen. But his countrymen remained as before in doubt and confusion as to where they stood on that war in faraway Korea. In the villages and towns of America, no trumpets blew for Korea, no drums rolled. Korea was far, far away. And so was the war. It was a prosperous time with more jobs and bigger paychecks than ever before. Nobody was asking that awkward question from the last time. Don't you know there's a war on? Sometimes the war that was on couldn't even make the front page. But Korea tainted the atmosphere. Something seemed wrong. Fouled up. What were we doing in that godforsaken corner of Asia? And why were we taking such a beating there? Nowadays, you could get the news in a barroom by television, but you still couldn't understand it. There was a smell of treason in the air. Traitors like the Rosenbergs were passing atomic secrets to the Russians. Some were caught, but who knew how many others there were? It was a time of anxiety, frustration, distrust. Thousands were sure that dark and sinister forces were at work behind that mess in Korea. And no one carried such suspicions to more violent extremes than Senator Joseph R. McCarthy, a Republican of Wisconsin, whose sledgehammer charges of communist infiltration into government jolted and dismayed the nation throughout the Korean War. American boys are dying in Korea, he charged, because of sabotage and subversion in the State Department. He demanded the impeachment of the president, whose policies he castigated as a treasonable farce. His bludgeoning allegations were given a name that marked an era, McCarthyism. And it divided the nation at home while the battle continued to rage in Korea. In Korea, recovery and more than recovery as the United Nations once again took the offensive in major operations called Killer and Ripper. Operations supported by massive round-the-clock air bombardment of Chinese troops and their tenuous supply lines. Far away in the Pentagon, a general was trying to make clear why American military might continued to be committed to the cause of Korea. And he said, as free men, we had to draw the line somewhere. Now the line drawn in Korea was holding again, and the bombers were helping to hold it. Without the Air Force, Korea could not have been held. With it, the 8th Army could turn around after the Hungnam evacuation and carry the war back into enemy terrain. They came driving north again, back across the 38th parallel. And when they stopped, it wasn't the enemy that stopped them. The flag never flew over a tougher, prouder fighting force, said General Matthew Ridgway, the new Supreme Commander who had led them back. Now he had news that brought his offensive to a voluntary halt. From the enemy side, through a Russian spokesman, a request for a ceasefire parley had come. The United Nations troops used 13 different languages to welcome the announcement. It was early July of 1951 when the first United Nations truce team arrived at the village of Kaesong behind the Red Lines. The Communists sent their toughest negotiators, and the UN delegation was headed by Vice Admiral Charles Turner Joy. An arrogant display of armed troops in what was supposed to be a neutral area was an early Communist affront, and it set the tone for what was coming. From the start, the Communists sought to gain by talking what they had failed to win by fighting. They insisted on the 38th parallel, which they no longer held. They demanded the withdrawal of foreign troops from South Korea, which would allow them to repeat their invasion. The talks got nowhere. There was hope when the truce talks began, high hope that the dismal Korean War was ending. But instead, a new one began at Kaesong, the talking war, and it would go on and on. The other war, the real one, sagged into stalemate, a hopeless grind of not winning, not losing, not ending. The flickering rumors of peace were only another ordeal. If ceasefire should come tomorrow, why die today? But the dying and the killing went on. Why are you fighting? A soldier was asked, and he said, well, I'd rather fight them here than in my own backyard. And it was as good an answer as any. The war was like the Korean hills. They came in 7 shades of brown, and it was a brown-tasting war, drab and dreary and cruel. When one was taken, nothing was settled. There was only another Korean hill, and then another. The hills, like the war, went on and on, from nowhere to eternity. The soldiers named them: Old Baldy, Pork Chop, Bloody Ridge. But one had a name that applied to all of them: Heartbreak. And for the men in those Korean hills, there was no need to ask the question, don't you know there's a war on? They knew. It was the North Korean Chief of Staff, Nam Il, who fronted the Communist peace delegation. But it was the Chinese who gave him orders. And the orders still were: demand everything, concede nothing. And while the talks dragged on, American casualties were mounting by 2,500 a month. By your obdurate and unreasoning refusal to negotiate, Admiral Joy told him, you have brought these meetings to a standstill. It had no effect. He got into his American-made car and drove off. Of the nations of the world, MacArthur said, Korea alone is the sole one which has risked its all against communism. The courage and fortitude of the Korean people, he said, defies description. Some, many, were too young for courage. We are not in this country as conquerors, the UN said. We are here as friends. What friendship and compassion could do was done. It was not enough. Nothing could be enough for the homeless waifs of Seoul. What could be done was done. They chose a new truce village, Panmunjom, but the talks went no better. Now the communists were demanding that all prisoners on both sides be forced to return at war's end, while the UN insisted on free choice, saying, "We will not buy an armistice by turning over human beings for slaughter or slavery." Deadlock. But the communists were concocting another kind of prisoner of war explosion far from Panmunjom. It would come on June of 1952, and it would shake the UN command. On Koji Island, thousands of fanatical Red prisoners armed with homemade weapons organized the compound into a nest of rebellion. Incredibly, they had kidnapped the camp commander, an American general, and held him captive. Camp authorities hesitated to use force, fearful of damaging the peace talks by giving the communists a propaganda issue. The situation was out of hand. Then General Hayden Boatner, a tough combat officer, took charge at Koji with instructions to do whatever had to be done. His own orders were, go in and roust them out. The rousting began with tear gas and concussion grenades. It was a full-dress military operation, and the strange Korean War saw yet another strange spectacle. American tanks and paratroops sent into action against a prisoner of war camp. The troops used bayonets and rifle butts and had orders to subdue, not to kill. But Koji was a battle. Prisoners were taken prisoner. The peculiar battle of Koji Island was over, but the communists had yet another propaganda issue to disrupt the peace talks. Cruelty to prisoners. There were other prisoners too, UN prisoners, American prisoners. They were herded off into North Korea, into Manchuria, on long, humiliating marches, underfed, exposed to cold and disease, at the mercy of brutal guards. It was a march into degradation. Their captors demanded more of them than name, rank, and serial number. Communism sought to plunder them of body, soul, and spirit. By means of mental rape and physical abuse, their captors worked to change them from loyal Americans into communist fanatics. For some, a few, a fraction, the march into the prison camp was a trek into treason. It was called brainwashing, the steady, corrosive indoctrination that twisted the mind and corrupted the spirit. Combined with exhaustion and despair, it seduced some Americans into statements that provided more propaganda for communist agitators throughout the world. From it, the communists fabricated one of the greatest propaganda hoaxes of all time, the charge that the American Air Force was bombarding Korea with plague germs. To the fake evidence and faked photographs, the communists added the ultimate, carefully staged confessions, also fake, by brainwashed American pilots.
My germination took place on the 27th of March, 1952, and it was a VT germination. 27th March, yes, 1952.
Seoul had changed hands 4 times in the up and down fighting and looked it. There wasn't much to do there on a 3-day pass but wander around and wonder when the war would end, if ever. But in the fall of '52, there was talk of the presidential election back home. And one of the candidates had made an electrifying statement. A resolution, he called it. In Seoul, the soldiers heard it by radio relay.
That resolution will be to forego the diversions of politics and to concentrate on the job of ending the Korean War. That job requires a personal trip to Korea. I shall go to Korea.
He came to Korea, Dwight Eisenhower, now the 34th President of the United States. And the visit bucked up the Koreans, and it bucked up the troops, who were beginning to think that America had forgotten them. In a brief tour of the front, the president had a glimpse of a kind of war that even he, as a general, had never seen before. The troops of the Civil War, it was said, were touched with fire. In the First World War, they fought to make the world safe for democracy. And World War II was the Great Crusade. But Korea? In Korea, the weary troops could only say what a soldier of Xenophon said 2,000 years before. I'm tired of marching and carrying arms and falling in and keeping guard and fighting. I want a little rest. But there was reason for fighting. We will bury you, the Russians have said. In Korea, they showed they meant it, literally. On the people of South Korea, they inflicted atrocities such as the world had not seen since Buchenwald and Auschwitz. You have nothing to lose but your chains was the old Marxist slogan. In Korea, it meant you have everything to lose, including your life. After 3 years, 1 month, and 2 days of war, truce came. The death of Stalin had left the communist world torn with dissension, and the Korean stalemate was now only an encumbrance to the Kremlin. It was being liquidated. General William Harrison signed for the United Nations, 2 full years after the truce talks began. It was 10 in the morning of July 27th, 1953, when the papers were signed and the news went out that the truce was scheduled to take effect in exactly 12 hours. 10 p.m. was the crucial time. The word was passed along the line, from command post to bunker to trench to outpost. Only 12 hours of war were left, 720 minutes. But during those 720 minutes, the war would still be on. The Chinese could still attack and snipe and shoot and kill. Would they? The line sweated it out. They waited for nightfall, for 10 o'clock. Then, if the enemy kept his word, the agreed-on signal would come. Flares and star shells to announce, yes, at last the fighting and the killing would be over. As it ended, a soldier asked, "Who won?" It ended not with a bang, but a fizzle. There was no victory in Korea celebration, no VK Day. But there were those who had reason to thank God. The sick and the wounded came back first from the prison camps. They were the lucky ones. More than 2,700 Americans and thousands of other UN soldiers died in communist hands. But now the agony was over. This was Freedom Village, a way station on the long road back. Physical abuse, mental torture. Some had broken under the strain. Most had not. One who did not break was General William Dean. He was captured early in the war while fighting in the front lines with his men. The Medal of Honor awaited him. Under the punishing ordeal of his 3-year imprisonment, his hair had turned white. Now came the direct reports from communist captivity. For the first time, it became known how the torment of brainwashing could extort a false confession of germ warfare, even from an American Air Force colonel.
During the entire period of my captivity, I was held in solitary confinement in some sort of a small room with no windows and a closed door, with no sunlight and no fresh air, no exercise. Alternately, I was starved and fed. I went through extended periods, one 12-day period and one 7-day period of not being allowed to sleep at all. I was bullied, slapped around, kicked around, made to stand at attention for extended period of times in the hot room. Sit on a stool after extended sleepless nights under a bright light with constant bullying and interrogation, frequently with a gun in my back. And for most of the period, I was not permitted. I was in a room that was so small that I could not lie down. I was not permitted to stand up, to close my eyes, or to recline in any way. After this 20 weeks of this solitary and torture and bullying business, I would say that I was mentally active about like a 10 or 11-year-old child.
Prouder tales were told. Against red brutality, soldiers like Master Sergeant Carrie Wynell had pitted an iron courage. He had been captured, shot, and buried alive.
After they thought everybody was dead, they started burying us. I heard shovels, working shovels up the other end. They went shoveling dirt in on all the men. Myself, come close to getting panicky about that time, but something or other, I figured as long as I had some breath, there was hope. So I let them bury me, loose dirt up over my head. The weight of the dirt was making me breathe pretty heavy, and I was afraid they could hear me breathe even. I stayed in that position approximately an hour. In that hour's time, they made another check on them, and evidently somebody down the line had moved or something, and they finished them off. I might add, in that whole group that I was with, there was not a man that begged for mercy, or there wasn't a man that cracked under the deal. Also, one man head was just wounded. He asked for another one. Pardon me, sir. So the only thing I can say is, if there's any communists in this country, the only thing for them to do is go take a look in the mirror and see the biggest sucker that ever lived.
And there were some. Defectors so thoroughly brainwashed that they turned their coats and chose to remain under communism. There were 327 in all. 305 were South Koreans, 1 was British, 21 were Americans.
We are South Koreans, American, and British who love our homes, our people, and our countries. What unites us all is our desire for peace, for real democracy and social equality. Why we are not going home? We know from our experience what is going on in South Korea. For those returning prisoners that escaped the firing squads in the concentration camp, there's the press gang, landlordism, poverty, and the prostitution of life under the rule of an American puppet. In America, the witch hunt, McCarthyism.
I stayed behind to escape the Red Bait and McCarthy and to assure that I'll never again have to fight in another unjust war as I did in Korea.
We are staying of our own free will, and in spite of repeated efforts by the Koreans and the Chinese to persuade us to return.
I'm staying back because I want to fight for peace. And I feel that I cannot do it in my homeland, which I love and will return to someday, whenever freedom of speech is not just written on paper, it is a reality. At that time, I will return home to continue fighting for peace. But until then, I will stay abroad to fight for peace, where I can speak out and tell the people of the world that I really want peace, why I am staying, and that this is the thing.
And so, 21 Americans stayed. It was a major shock of the Korean War. Most of them would turn their coats again and come trickling home. Staying was the worst mistake I ever made, said Corporal Scott Rush, one of the 21. Freedom song, freedom song, freedom song. But more than 25,000 Chinese and North Korean prisoners renounced communism without benefit of brainwashing. Thousands chose instead to fight communism by joining the Army of Free China on Formosa. We will not turn human beings over to slaughter or slavery, the UN had insisted at the truce talks. The free world had its reward. Over the abandoned battlefields, a question still hovered. Did we win? The soldiers repeated it as they packed up the war, storing away its paraphernalia for perhaps another day. The strangest war ever fought by man, it was called. It had ended without victory, without defeat, almost exactly where it started. But in the first hot war collision between the free world and communism, armed aggression had been stopped in its tracks. A line had been drawn, the line had held. That would have to be the free world's substitute for victory. And for the first time, men from every continent of the earth had fought and died together for peace. That was a victory for all mankind. A forgotten army remained on guard because the war that was never officially war left a land still divided, with a peace that was not peace, only armistice. 10 years and more after the truce, along 150 miles of the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, running roughly parallel to the old parallel, the old enemies were still face to face. Hostility is bitter and personal on the DMZ, erupting into continual charge and countercharge and sometimes violence. It is the open end of that war in Korea. We are still faced with the same enemy, the Army tells its troops. We must be ready. So in the long Korean armistice, the longest in history, Korea remains what it was from the start, unsettled, uncertain, without solution, a symptom of a troubled time, a symbol of a world divided.
In only a little while, that so-called police action seemed to matter less and less, not only to those who fought there, but to history. In fact, for 40 years, the only monument to its veterans has been a meditation bench in Arlington National Cemetery. But it was an era of legendary figures. Generals Douglas MacArthur, Matthew Ridgway, Presidents Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower. Heroes to some, villains to others. Still, Americans of that generation say they always knew what their leaders were about. I'm Tom Brokaw, and this has been another in the series, America, A Look Back.